Now we're going to begin our last set of violent crimes. We're going to start with assault and battery. These two crimes generally go hand in hand in most states or jurisdictions, including New York. They are recognized together as one crime called assault, and the act just involves an unwanted touch, like a slap in the face would be considered a level of assault. But I need you to know the difference between assault and battery. It's important because there are some places that still look at it separately, and that's how it's described in the book. So what is an assault and what is a battery? Let's start with assault. Assault is intentionally, meaning you know what you're doing, knowingly, an unexcused act that creates in another person a reasonable apprehension or fear of immediate harmful or offensive contact. So an immediate harmful or offensive contact, the fear of or apprehension of, doesn't actually mean contact. And apprehension is not necessarily fear. Apprehension is if the contact is such that a reasonable person would want to avoid it, and there's a reasonable basis for believing that the contact will occur, then you have apprehension. Whether they're afraid or not doesn't matter. And just to hit this point home, assault does not mean there's touching involved. No touching is involved. We're focusing on the mind of the person, receiving or feeling the fear or the apprehension. And battery is the follow-through, an unexcused and harmful or offensive physical contact that's intentionally performed. And it could be the slightest of touching, can be a battery. Doesn't mean necessarily injury occurs, because a slap in the face. You might be shocked, you might have a red mark, but you're not going to the hospital and you're not getting medical treatment. The completion of the act that caused that apprehension. So you have the assault, and then you have a battery. And let me just give you a quick example, putting it together. Ivan enters Crown Convenience. It's a small neighborhood store. Pulling out a handgun, he demands the money from the cash register from Jean, who's the store clerk. Once Jean gives Ivan the money, he shoots her. So is there an assault here? Yes. What's the assault? Ivan's pointing the gun at Jean. This is an assault. Creates fear. Apprehension. Definitely fear. Battery is the firing the gun and hitting Jean with the bullet. So assault and battery, they go hand in hand. And that's our concept of these two. So let's kind of talk about different assaults and batteries. We have acquaintance and family assaults. While assault happens among strangers, violent attacks in the home or parties who know each other are quite common, and they are the most frightening. And there are several forms of this: child abuse, parental abuse, and spousal abuse. Let's talk about child abuse, which is any physical or emotional trauma inflicted on a child for which no reasonable explanation can be found. A reasonable explanation would be accident or ordinary discipline. What are the forms of abuse? Also includes neglect. What forms do these take? The abuse and neglect. Well, we have physical abuse. Physical abuse would be throwing, shooting, stabbing, burning, drowning, suffocating, biting, deliberately disfiguring a child. Shaken baby syndrome. It's also known as the shaken impact syndrome. It's a serious form of abuse inflicted upon a child. It usually occurs when a parent or other caregiver shakes a baby out of anger or frustration, often because the baby will not stop crying. And because babies have a very weak neck or neck muscles, they cannot fully support their large heads. And severe shaking causes the baby's head to move violently back and forth, resulting in serious and sometimes fatal brain injury. So these forces are exaggerated if the shaking is interrupted by the baby's head hitting a surface. Another assault. So physical abuse, physical neglect, parental failure to provide adequate food, shelter, medical care, proper clothing, or protection from physical abuse from another individual. So physical neglect is when a parent doesn't provide adequate food, shelter, medical care, proper clothing, or they don't protect that child from somebody who's abusing the child, usually like a step parent situation. Emotional abuse, constant criticism and rejection of the child. Emotional neglect, inadequate nurturing and attention to child's emotional development, lack of concern about maladaptive behavior. Abandonment, parents leave their children with the intention of severing the parent-child relationship. And then there's sexual abuse. Exploitation of children through rape, incest, or molestation by parents, family members, friends, or legal guardians. And this can constitute a range of acts. It can take many forms, including physical and non-physical behaviors. Physical behaviors would be like touching the child in places for sexual pleasure or other unnecessary reasons. Forcing a child to touch somebody else, their genitals, private areas, putting objects or body parts inside the vagina or in the mouth of or the anus of a child for sexual pleasure or other unnecessary reasons. There's non-physical behaviors, exposing a child to pornography, encouraging a child to perform sexual acts, exposing a person's genitals to a child, performing sexual acts in a child's presence, photographing a child in sexual poses, watching a child undress or use the bathroom, often without the child's knowledge, using computers, cell phones, or social media outlets to make sexual overtures or expose a child have all been considered forms of sexual abuse. Children of abuse experience a wide range of symptoms and behavior problems that follow them into adulthood, and children of abuse also become abusers themselves. Also leads to them involved in delinquent and criminal behavior. So what causes child abuse and neglect? Maltreatment of children is quite complex. There isn't neither a single cause nor a single solution. Factors associated with child abuse are parents who themselves suffered from abuse, cycle of violence. The presence of an unrelated adult increases the risk of abuse, like a step-parent. Isolated and alienated families tend to become abusive. Other related causes, substance abuse, parents use substances or alcohol, social class, as I said earlier, step-parents and abuse. There's always a higher level of abuse in the house when we have a step-parent relationship. All of these have played a role, and a lot of these overlap. Parental abuse is another form of assault and battery. Parents are sometimes the target of their children's abuse, and there are a number of facts from studies that are outlined in the book relative to children who abuse their parents. And, there's a kind of an extension of this called elder abuse. As the parents even get older, they're subject to abuse, not only from their children, but other folks as well, especially if they're placed in a nursing home situation. Spousal abuse is another form. This is a type of abuse that has been recorded throughout history. The term spousal assault or spousal abuse has been noted to inappropriately imply that male and female spouse are equally likely to be victims. However, the overwhelming majority of the victims of marital violence within a heterosexual relationships are women. So intimate partner assault is also used to characterize assaultive behavior that takes place between individuals in an intimate relationship, or IPA, and it's also called spousal abuse. This is still a significant problem, which can lead to long-term effects. The studies have found that 16% of women have experienced sexual violence by an intimate partner, 10% have been raped. Dating violence is also a significant concern. This is a form of violence aimed at boyfriend or girlfriend, or between partners. 1 in 5 high school girls may suffer sexual or physical abuse from a boyfriend. The physical abuse can range from pushing, slapping, choking, holding them down, beating them, biting them. It is also not just physical, though. It can also be emotional abuse, where a partner tries to damage a person's relationship with the other by spreading false rumors or starting a smear campaign or even revealing personal information about them. And they call that relational aggression. So dating violence kind of goes hand in hand with intimate partner assault. So that's our assault and battery. Our next violent crime is robbery, and it is classified as a violent crime because it involves the threat or use of force. It is, however, a property crime as well, in that the express purpose of robbery is to take the property of another, but by doing that, you're using violence or force. The UCR data, Uniform Crime Report data, shows that 325,000 robberies occur each year. Larger cities recorded higher rates than robbery. 41% were committed without a weapon, 40% with a firearm, and 8% with a knife. And then the rest, there was a variety of weapons. They can occur in different locations, such as on the street. Muggings, for an example, it can happen in a commercial setting, such as gas stations, stores, and banks. Home invasion, where it takes place at a private, occupied dwelling. So what motivates robbers? Fast cash, and it's generally for basic needs, to get money to pay rent, get money to buy food, get money to buy drugs. It's usually for something that they need instantaneously. Research shows that not much planning goes into committing robberies, but they do choose their targets carefully. So their goal is not to get caught. So they look for vulnerable victims, those that are accessible, and they know that they can get something from it. Hence, that's why we have acquaintance robbery. Why would you rob someone you know? Because it's easy, God, they know who you are, they can turn you in. But the research shows that victims are often reluctant to report because they know the person. Some are just motivated by getting even, street justice. Robbers also do this because they know it's a good take, because if they know the person, they know there's something there, they know something about them, and they're convenient. It's convenient to rob somebody you know than try and find the vulnerable target. Carjacking is a form of robbery if the victim is in the car. Remember, we are forcefully taking property of another. And this isn't a random crime, and these are not committed by amateurs. With carjacking, they are carefully planned out, and it's done so by experienced criminals, as the research shows relative to carjacking. It's not a random crime, a random criminal act. Now we're going to turn to some more developed interpersonal violence crimes, contemporary forms. We talked about rape and murder and assault and robbery. These crimes have been around for centuries, and those are traditional interpersonal violent crimes. However, over time, other violent crimes have been emerging from these crimes, including hate crimes, stalking, and workplace violence. We're going to start with hate crimes. We touched on hate crimes back at the beginning of the semester when you completed the assignment involving the sentence imposed on the couple from Georgia who, along with others, drove around an African-American neighborhood terrorizing people, holding out shotguns and waving the Confederate flag. Let's delve into this a bit more. The Uniform Crime Report began mandating the collection of hate crime information after Congress passed the Hate Crime Statistics Act. Hate crimes, also known as bias crimes, are characterized by manifestive evidence of prejudice based on race, religion, sexual orientation, or ethnicity, including, where appropriate, the crimes of murder, manslaughter, aggravated assault, simple assault, intimidation, arson, and destruction, damage, or vandalism of property is taking place. So a person commits one of those or more acts, and their motivation behind it is hate. they commit arson, they commit simple assault, and they commit murder, and they're driven by hate under one of those categories. They hate the person's race, their religion, sexual orientation, or ethnicity. Based on the UCR review of all hate crimes, reported sexual orientation and religion motivated the hate crimes the most. They made up the large percentage of hate crimes, followed by ethnicity and race, and these numbers continue to climb. So what motivates hate crime? In 1993, Jack McDevitt and Jack Levin, two social scientists in Boston, examined 169 hate crime case files at the Boston Police Department. They then interviewed victims, offenders, and investigators. McDevitt and Levin found that there are 4 main kinds of hate crimes, ranging from thrill seekers, the most common, to mission offenders, the rare but often lethal hardcore haters. And here are the 4 categories of hate crimes, along with some examples. Many of these hypotheticals I took from the FBI's training manual on recognizing and collecting data on hate crimes. So we have our thrill-seeking individuals. These hate crimes are often driven by an immature itch for excitement and drama. Think bored and drunk young men parading through neighborhoods, mayhem on their minds. Often there is no real reason for these crimes. Experts say they're committed for the thrill of it, and the victims are vulnerable simply because of their sexual, racial, ethnic, gender, or religious backgrounds differ from those of the attackers. Often the attackers think society doesn't care about these victims, or worse, will applaud their assault. The attackers may be young, but they are dangerous. 70% of these thrill offenses were assaults, including vicious beatings that put victims in the hospital. That said, the attackers' animosity toward their victims, who are chosen at random, can be relatively low, which at least offers the opportunity for rehabilitation. Example of this, a group of teens breaks into an LGBT center, destroys property, and scrawls anti-gay graffiti on the walls. A street gang assaults a Hindu man while yelling anti-Hindu epithets. A group of men viciously attack men leaving a well-known gay bar, yelling sissy and girly man. Those are all examples of a hate crime. Defensive or reactive. In these hate crimes, the attackers see themselves as defending their turf, their neighborhood, their workplace, their religion, or their country. Unlike thrill seekers who invade other neighborhoods and attack without warning, defenders target specific victims and justify their crimes as necessary to keep threats at bay. Many times they are triggered by a particular event, such as a Muslim or a black family moving into the new neighborhood. Like thrill seekers, the defenders show little or no remorse for their attacks and believe that most, if not all, of society supports them but is too afraid to act. They honestly believe that what they're doing has some sort of communal assent. And some examples of this: a group home for people with psychiatric disabilities is set on fire by a man heard to say, "I'll get rid of those crazies." A transgender woman is attacked near her home by men who yell, "We don't want no queers in this neighborhood." Those are some examples of a defensive hate crime. Retaliatory. These hate crimes are often seen as revenge, whether in response to personal slights, other hate crimes, or terrorism. The avengers, who often act alone, target members of the racial, ethnic, or religious group who they believe committed the original crime, even if the victims had nothing to do with it. They care only about revenge, and they will travel to the victim's territory to enact it. These eye for an eye attacks spike after acts of terrorism, a bitter backlash that often targets Muslim Americans after 9/11 attacks. For example, hate crimes against Arabs and Muslims rose to over 1,500%. A similar spike occurred after the Paris attacks in 2015. Occasionally, members of the same religion or racial group target each other. Ohio prosecutors, for example, charged members of a breakaway Amish sect with hate crimes after they violently cut off the beards of a rival sect. An appeals court overturned the hate crime conviction, though, ruling that religion had been a significant but not primary motivation behind the assaults. Some other examples: a woman fires gunshots into the men's locker room of a fitness center, saying she hates men for rejecting her. Hours after Islamic extremists launch a terrorist attack in Europe, someone defaces an American mosque with graffiti that says, "Go home, terrorists." Those are some examples of the retaliatory. Mission offenders. These are the deadliest and rarest types of hate crimes. They are committed by people who consider themselves crusaders, often for a religious or racial cause. Their mission: total war against members of a rival race or religion. They're often linked to groups that share their racist views. Mission offenders write lengthy manifestos explaining their views, visit websites full of hate speech and violent imagery, and travel to target symbolically significant sites while seeking to maximize their carnage. Mission offenders believe that the system is rigged against them, which means that they can justify excessive violence against innocents. These hate crimes can look a lot like terrorism, and scholars say mission offenders often overlap both definitions, as in the case of the man is a Muslim man who killed 49 people at the nightclub in Orlando. At the time, President Obama called the massacre both an act of terror and an act of hate. Some examples of mission offenders: they tend to become infamous. Oklahoma City bomber Timothy McVeigh, Charleston church shooter Dylan Roof, and the one I just mentioned, Omar Mateen, who killed 49 people at the gay nightclub in Orlando. So how do we control hate crime? Harsher penalties. That's what's happening primarily now. A person who commits murder, assault, property damage, etc., and they're motivated by hate, which needs to be proven, by the way. Prosecutor has to prove that the person was motivated by hate. And if they're found guilty, the punishment can be increased, that the person can be sentenced to. So remember that couple from Georgia who wrote the assignment on? The court enhanced their sentence because the crime was considered a hate crime. They were motivated by hate. And there are critics who say harsh punishment is unfair, as it is no different than committing a crime motivated by anger, greed, or revenge. Also, the offender may be motivated by something other than hate, according to critics. And there are several reasons laid out by Frederick Lawrence as to why those who commit hate crimes should be subjected to a harsher penalty. Those being the crimes are more likely to be more violent than the others. Significant emotional and psychological impact on the victim. There's a heightened sense of vulnerability that comes with that. Crimes violate the shared value of equality that all citizens have. And finally, crimes not only harm the victim, but also that target community as well. So it's not just when somebody commits a hate crime, it's not just the victim who is harmed, but the targeted community as well. What about free speech? This can be quite a lengthy topic, and I actually teach this for a week with relative to hate crime and in my media law class. So should symbolic acts of hate, such as displaying a swastika or burning a cross, be banned? Symbolic speech is protected by the First Amendment, and so is hate speech. Something else has to happen. Somebody can, spew and write about their hate feelings towards a gender or a race and such, but it's the steps that they take afterwards that may make it illegal. But symbolic speech and hate speech are protected under the First Amendment. But let's talk about symbolic speech. Displaying hateful symbols. within the bounds, like I said, of the First Amendment. However, the Supreme Court did rule that it would not be protected speech, and therefore the government can regulate such speech, meaning they can pass a law that says it is a crime, to do something, when the symbol of hate, and in the case that's mentioned in the book, Virginia versus Black, it was a burning cross, when the symbol of hate is being used to intimidate, and the person engaging in the conduct is doing so with the intent to intimidate. So there has to be some intention behind it. So the court said burning the cross, which has its roots intertwined with the Ku Klux Klan, is evidence of an intent to intimidate. So just by, the court further went on that says, just by burning the cross, there's already going to be a presumption of intent to intimidate. And obviously those things get flushed out in court. And I don't think the book goes into the details of the facts, but the fact is this, a little background, is Black owned a piece of property. He was on his own private property, and he was having a rally. I wouldn't call it a Ku Klux Klan rally, but the same sort of level of a rally, and they were burning a big cross, which was in their private land across the street from African American families. So in that case, Mr. Black was convicted for burning a cross, and obviously he intended to intimidate. So, free speech and hate crimes. Let's talk about workplace violence. What is it? Violent crimes that are committed in the workplace. And it is the second leading cause of occupational injury or death. Assaults account for the largest number of workplace violent incidences. Homicides that are committed in the workplace are primarily committed by robbers or other assailants, 70%, 21% by work associates. Workplace violence accounts for about 20% of all violent crimes that occurred in the U.S. Workplace violence falls into 4 types of categories, and these are very broad categories. Violent acts by criminals who have no other connection to the workplace, but they enter to commit a robbery, acts of terrorism, or other crime. Violence directed at employees by customers, clients, patients, students, inmates, or others for whom the organization provides services. Violence against coworkers and supervisors or managers by a present or former employee. And violence committed in the workplace by someone who doesn't work there but has a personal relationship with an employee, such as an abusive spouse or a domestic partner. So workplace violence, another type of emerging area relative to violent crimes. And then finally, stalking. This is a fairly new crime. California was the first state to create a stalking statute. It is also a law that is constantly misunderstood or misapplied. California has lots of celebrities, and sometimes fans become infatuated with them, constantly trying to contact them, follow them, befriend them, profess their love for them. And there was no law protecting this type of unwanted contact. And what prompted this action was the death of the actress Rebecca Schaefer, who was murdered by a lovesick fan, Robert John Bardo. The gist of the story is, after writing numerous letters to Schaefer, Bardo attempted to gain access to the set of the CBS television series My Sister Sam, in which Schaefer played a starring role. Ultimately, he obtained her home address via a detective agency, which in turn tracked it via California Department of Motor Vehicles records, and on July 18th, 1989, Bardo confronted Schaefer at her home, angry that she had appeared in a sex scene in the film Scenes from the Class Struggle in Beverly Hills, and in his eyes, she had lost her innocence and became just another Hollywood whore. He visited her at the apartment and told her he was a big fan. After having been turned away by Schaefer, Bardo stopped at a diner for breakfast, only to return to the apartment about an hour later, again ringing the doorbell. When Schaefer opened the door, he shot her in the chest. And side note, Marcia Clark, the famous prosecutor who prosecuted O.J. Simpson, prosecuted the Schaefer trial just before she took on the OJ case before OJ happened. So while stalking laws are generally neutral, so that's how we got stalking laws. Clearly, there was a lot of domestic instances as well, people who knew each other, where there was other crimes happening outside of an assault or a battery. They couldn't do much about it because there was no law. But California was the first state to pass it, and what really prompted it was that case. So, the purpose of stalking laws is to prevent the defendant from completing the assault and the battery, or the murder. Like in this case, had there been a stalking law in place, Schaefer would have been able to have him, when he was sending all of those letters and getting information about her, like clearly professing her love, clearly there was something happening beforehand that she was aware of. So the purpose of these stalking laws is to prevent the follow-through. While stalking laws are generally neutral or gender neutral, more women than men are the victims of the crime. In nearly 75% of stalking cases, the victim knows their stalker. 30% stalker is a current or former intimate partner. And the definition of stalking is any course of conduct that credibly threatens the victim's safety. That's quite a broad definition, isn't it? Any course of conduct that credibly threatens the victim's safety. So this can constitute a whole number of things. Here are some examples. Pursuing them, following them, showing up at the same places they are at, expressly or implicitly making threats to the victim or family members, the victim's family members, constant phone calls, voicemail, text, email, messenger, social media posts, letters in the mail. A whole slew of things can be a quote-unquote course of conduct, which means you need more than one act. It has to be repeated, course of conduct. So you might be asking, well, how many times? Usually 3. Most states say 3 or more, and New York is 3 or more. So looking back at that Bardo case, he wrote letters. He showed up at her house. He obtained her personal information, right? 5 types of stalkers have been identified. This information isn't in the book, but it was part of a study that I think is important you should know about. There's 5 types of stalkers that have been identified. The rejected stalker, who pursue their victims to reverse, correct, or avenge a felt rejection, like a divorce, a breakup, or a separation. Intimacy-seeking stalkers, those who want to establish an intimate, loving relationship with their victims and may see the victim as a soulmate with whom they are fated to have a relationship with. Incompetent suitors, those who have a romantic or sexual interest in their victims despite having poor social or courting skills. The resentful, vendetta-motivated stalkers, who act out of a sense of wrong or a grievance against their victims and whose intent is generally to frighten and distress the victim. And then we have a predatory stalker, who spy on their victims in preparation for attacks, which are usually sexual in nature. Delusional disorders were found to be common among the stalkers treated, and 30% were determined to suffer consistently from delusions about those they stalked. Stalking behavior can last from 4 weeks to 20 years, with the average being about 12 months. The rejected and the intimacy-seeking stalkers persist longer. Their persistence is longer. 63% of these stalkers made threats. 36% were assaultive. And the motives among them had varied. So there's not one motivating factor. They had varied. Now, another concept of stalking that is relatively new is cyber stalking. And it's basically the use of technology to harass individuals, and it can be more than just sending emails. So for instance, here's another quick example out of the state of California that I'll finish this topic with. A mere 3 weeks after California passed a law against cyber stalking, this man named Gary Della Penta is charged with using the internet to solicit the rape of a woman who had rejected his advances. On January 1st, 1999, California had become the first state to ban cyber stalking, or stalking that involves electronic communications. De La Penta went afoul of the new law by using the internet to get back at a woman who had repeatedly rejected his romantic interest in her. At first, the woman had no idea why men were banging on her door in the middle of the night saying that they were there to rape her. What he did was he placed an ad in her name on Craigslist that claimed that she had rape fantasies, and he also provided her address and instructions for disarming her security system. And at least 6 men saw this ad and came to her home, and many more called with obscene messages. When she finally learned about the internet ads, she placed notes on her door explaining that the ads were false. However, he then placed new ads saying that the notes were part of the fantasy. He was caught when the victim's father pretended to respond to the ads and trace their origin. That's a form of cyber stalking. You don't actually need to be the one to do the stalking. You put somebody in a place. It's a course of conduct that puts the victim in reasonable sense of their fear of their safety. And just to finish it out, he was sentenced to 6 years, by the way, for that conduct. So that concludes our discussion on violent crimes in Chapter 10.